Welcome and thank you for joining me in my keynote address for the 9th International Conference for Science Educators. I am Karen Murcia. I'm an Associate Professor at Curtin University and also a Chief Investigator with the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child. I'm joining you virtually today from Perth, Western Australia, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of my homelands, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The title of my presentation today is Children's Creative STEM Inquiry. So what I'm aiming to do through this keynote presentation is to explore with you how children's creativity can be positioned as a social and constructivist process in STEM learning projects. So in doing this, I want to work together with you and provoke thinking around what is creativity, and in turn then share a research tool with you for exploring children's creativity and teachers' creative practices in their pedagogy, the A to E of Young Children's Creativity Framework. And I'm going to elaborate that and illustrate the framework by giving an example from a previous research project where we observed children's creative thinking and doing in a STEM inquiry project. I do want to finish the presentation by also sharing with you and providing a link to an Australian STEM learning resource, which I'm hoping you will find very useful and something you can take back to your classrooms or even think about in terms of a research focus and project for yourselves. So I did want to start by thinking about the nature of STEM, and simply that, given the audience and who's in the room, the virtual room for this conference, we do know STEM is an acronym and it stands for science, technology, engineering and mathematics. But what I do want to make explicit here is the approach that I take in my research and is evidenced through my research projects and team in the Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child. So we are working with STEM inquiry projects where we are positioning STEM as a cross-disciplinary idea or construct, where children are applying and building knowledge by drawing across the multiple fields within STEM. So they think creatively, they're problem solving, and they may even be constructing multimodal representations of their learning or producing original and creative products from their STEM inquiry. So our perspective of STEM is one where the disciplines are integrated, and it's about connected knowledge and drawing across the discipline fields. So STEM projects and inquiry projects with the children are based on real world experiences and things that the children are interested in, and hence they're meaningful experiences for the children to engage with. Now, creativity, if we look in the literature, is perhaps not as well defined or there's less sort of unified thinking about the nature of creativity. So what I would like to do to start with is for you to think about what is creativity to you and what do you understand about creativity? Who is creative? And would you please take a moment and write down the name of a creative person? Because I do want to come back and reflect on the different kind of views and positionings around creativity. Write down the name of somebody that you think is creative. I would very much like to be in the room to hear your ideas, but I hope by sharing mine that you will find there's some synergies and that you may even have the same person written down as your creative person. So I've chosen 3 examples here to reflect on. The first one, of course, there, Vincent van Gogh, very much the arts and these amazing creative pieces produced by artists. And I think there has been traditionally a schooling or a school of thought where creativity belongs to the arts. But I'm sure as STEM educators and as scientists in the room, you would also see that STEM creativity is core to innovations. And think about the works of Leonardo da Vinci, who, yes, is an artist, but what a innovative and creative thinker he was with his innovations and inventions that he presented and prepared. Now, the work of Marie Curie is also an example of creativity and demonstrating how creativity is core to the nature of science. So Marie Curie was discovered in the radioactive materials, and in fact, her work, her synthesizing, her evaluating, her investigating, and her experimentation has led to innovations and a creative product in terms of cancer treatments that have continued to evolve through history. And we still draw today on a lot of the principles and practices of Marie Curie in treating cancers with radiotherapy. So I wanted to take a moment and to highlight that there are diverse perspectives of creativity, but clearly creativity doesn't just belong to the arts, and it doesn't just belong in the arts discipline. It is an underpinning 21st century learning skill that we know is embedded within STEM and is core to the nature of science itself. And any mathematicians, I'm sure, would know that mathematical reasoning and finding mathematical solutions can in itself be a creative thinking process. So this next slide, I have shared with you some photos of teachers and children, and I want to expand our thinking to consider teachers as creative practitioners and creative teaching practices, and in turn, our young children as creative thinkers in STEM inquiry projects. So we have our first photo of a teacher in Thailand working with a group of young children on a STEM construction project. And then partnering there, we have a young teacher from Western Australia who is working with children who were in fact 4 years of age, and together they are exploring coding and the creative practice of generating ideas for coding stories, sequences and patterns in inputting a code and creating movement in a toy robot. So the Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child, the core project that I lead, is focused on children's creativity and connectedness with digital technologies. So through this centre and through the work that I'm going to share with you today, we are aiming to innovate STEM education through research and teachers' professional development that is building both creative teaching practices, but also creative thinking habits and practices for the children in our classrooms. So we are aiming to promote STEM as a vehicle that is with the technology component. Digital technologies are embedded in STEM, and in this era of digital innovations, we are seeing digital technologies as integral to STEM education. So we're wanting to position children as creators and able to construct and represent with digital technologies rather than to being simply passive consumers of digital products. So we are encouraging practices and exploring strategies for how children can be active and hands-on and empowered with digital tools where they take creative control. And this, of course, being supported by quality and innovative teaching, where we have creative teachers and their practices too. So our research centre is very interested in understanding what creativity looks like amongst young children, and in particular in the STEM learning environment. We are very interested to see who is doing the creative thinking. Children, given the opportunity to explore, do they have agency, and do they collaborate and connect in a way that they are thinking for themselves creatively in their practices and in their STEM projects. I had an interesting experience and opportunity presented to me to also do a keynote presentation for an European Nations Cost project. And at the time, I was asked to speak about children's creative coding. We had some great examples and case studies of young children working in early years centres and schools to share with the participants. But at the time, it made me very reflective about how we were defining creativity, and then as researchers describing creativity in our case studies and the observations that we had made. So this sent the research group, myself included, on a journey of really interrogating research literature and practitioners' reports around the nature of creativity and how that is represented within research published literature. Now, a lot of the work that we focused on drew across the age ranges from young children right through to adults as creative practitioners with creative habits and so on. Now, the work of Mel Rhodes from 1961 really resonated with us as a research team at the time, and we used this as a starting premise for defining creativity and elaborating the various elements within creative practice within the projects that we had been engaging with. So we saw this as both an inductive and deductive approach to our analysis. We started in a very immersed and grounded way, and then we went back and refined our thinking through a framework of creativity that we developed based and drawing from a lot of the literature, but in particular Mel Rhodes, the 4 Ps of creativity. So Rhodes described creativity not just simply as a product, but he also said and encouraged thinking, as we were grappling with, about who was doing the creative thinking. Was it a very clever designer who had constructed a project or a product? Was it a very clever teacher who had amazing creative practices? Or was it actually a child doing the creative thinking for themselves? So the perspective on who's doing the creative thinking. In Rhodes' work, he talked about the notion of place, where for us as educators and working with a STEM education context, we took the notion of press and thought about it as a learning environment and place. So we were very much guided through Rhodes' work to look at and define and elaborate what were the elements of an enabling environment for children's creative thinking and, of course, their practices and their doing. So the 4th element and the 4th P being the process. So creativity is more than simply a product. It is a recognition of who's doing the original thinking or the elements in the environment that can create a conducive learning environment for creativity, but seeing that it is a process. Creativity is a process that people go through, young children go through in generating these original creative products. So as educators, we weren't only interested in the product, in these STEM inquiry projects, we were also interested in children's processes that they went through in generating a creative output. So we talked about these as the processes of children's creative thinking. So as I said, we took an inductive and deductive approach, and ultimately a very much refined framework from this process was published, and it's called the A to E of children's creativity, and it's a framework for young children's creative practices. And this was published in Issues in Education Research for those of you who would like to read that paper and engage with this at a deeper level. But what this framework did for us at the time and going forward is, yes, it was generated from research, so it was validated by research. But it provided a framework for analysing and interrogating the data we were collecting in STEM inquiry projects for this important 21st century capability of creativity. It also gave a tool for taking or translating the research that we've done to professional development opportunities for teachers in the classroom. So we've worked with teachers who are now using this framework for designing STEM inquiry projects, for thinking about how they structure and set up their learning environment, and then in turn for monitoring children's use of process skills and development of creativity. So monitoring and ultimately assessing children's development of creative thinking practices. So like Mel Rhodes in his 1961 reference that we very much drew from for this, we took a 4Ps approach. We did look at and think and interrogate around the notion of product. So the product being original, it was something that was original to the person working within the project and doing the thinking and the doing. So what I mean by that is it may not be a huge big C type creative product like Van Gogh or Leonardo da Vinci or Marie Curie, but it may be an original thinking, an idea or solution for a young child. It's new to that child, and therefore we saw this as original for the child. And I think that's very important to distinguish the everyday little C of creativity and to contrast that to these major creative endeavours and products that we see through history. So if it's original to the child or to the person doing the thinking and development, then it is in itself a creative project being fit for a process or an outcome. It doesn't have to be original to humanity, but it is original to the person involved, and in our case, the children we're working with in the STEM inquiry projects. So we think about the product, that it's original and fit for purpose, and we are very mindful of the perspective on who is doing the original thinking. We do see a lot of fantastic creative practices with educators and hence children following teachers' creative practice, and they're doing things that result in a creative product. But who did the original creative thinking? Was it a very talented and creative teacher, or perhaps a software designer, or was it the child themselves? So we are working and exploring and interrogating and pushing forward in the space of children being empowered to be the creative thinkers. And so that is the three kind of different areas that we have observed creativity in the environments, both by the educator, by the child following what the educator is doing, and ultimately where we want to land with the work we're doing and the strategies we propose, where children are doing the creative thinking for themselves. Now, I'm sure as educators, you would have all thought about the importance of the learning environment in which children are engaging with STEM inquiry projects. Resourcing is important, and ensuring that if we want creative practices and creative outputs and thinking from children, we need to resource the environment. So that doesn't just mean lots of stimulating materials. Yes, that's great, and that is a part of it, and ensuring that there are enough materials for all of the young people participating, but that we resource it and we think about the time given to inquiry projects as an important resourcing element. Time is a resource, and we need to make that available to children so they have the time to explore and develop creative thinking and practices. Teachers also resource their environments, not just in the physical materials, but also in an intentional way around how they set up provocations in the learning environment. What do you put into the learning environment or the resource that might spark a child's thinking or curiosity? So think about the resourcing and materials and the time and how you structure and put things in place. Now, through the research, we saw very much that the nature of communication affected, either enhanced or perhaps even put some limits in place at times with children's creative practices and thinking. So the learning conversations, are they intentional in their nature? Is a teacher going in there and working with a child and focused on the child and hearing what the child is saying and responding to their ideas and engaging in this two-way conversation or a dialogic conversation with the child around their STEM ideas and their experiences and observations. So as teachers, we're using an inquiry questioning approach, open questions, where we're really working with the children to elicit and hear their ideas and even responding and engaging with the questions that they're asking. So creativity, we are also seeing a strong connection to children's creativity and their well-being. So well-being and creativity, can a child who doesn't feel safe or is in a pressure-free environment where they can have agency and explore or allowed to make mistakes, those elements contribute to their well-being, but importantly, the socio-emotional climate of a learning environment either hinders or helps and scaffolds and supports children's creative thinking. So we do want you to consider these three elements: the resources, the nature of communication, and just those social and emotional elements of the environment, and thinking about children's well-being, because the two are very closely tied, well-being and creativity. When we were analysing the data out of the various projects, it became apparent that there was a range of process skills that the children were using and engaging with and demonstrating as they were thinking creatively. It's difficult in fact, you can't directly see a child's thinking process, but we can see expressions of that in multiple modes, by what they say, how they manipulate materials, or facial expressions, and so on. So we were looking to see what were the process skills and what evidence could we identify of these processes that children were using and taking in a creative endeavour in their STEM inquiry. So we were a little bit creative ourselves. The A to E of creativity, we really saw that there were categories of processes that the children were demonstrating. So the first one, agency. So, it's the hearts-on notion of a STEM inquiry for a child. Did they find personal relevance and meaning in what they were doing in their projects? Did they have a purpose? Did they feel that they were they had some self-determination and autonomy in what they chose to do? And in that, was there sufficient openness and freedom for them to be agile and to be able to adjust what they do as things evolved in their project? So agency was a critical component of the processes that children demonstrated and used as they were inquiring in their STEM projects and being creative. So the being curious component of it, because we couldn't have two C's, so being curious, we were very focused and interested in children's questioning, their curiosity, they're wondering, imagining, they were exploring and discovering ideas. And we refer to it as possibility thinking, or the what if type questions that we saw from the children. Children were also connecting. They were seeing patterns in ideas, they were reflecting on what is or what could be, and sharing ideas with others, and bringing and synthesising these ideas together to form something new and, in fact, creative in the problem solving or the generation process. Children were able to see different perspectives, and they were drawing on different ideas and connecting them together. With creativity, it is about producing something that is original, and hence you've got to be a bit daring to be original, because you've got to be different. And this comes back to the social emotional element of this and well-being. Do children feel safe and supported in the environment to dare to be different? Are they willing to be different and to persist when things became challenging or difficult? And did they learn from failures when things went wrong? So for children, or for any of us engaging in a creative process, we have to be prepared to really challenge some underlying assumptions. We've got to be daring to think differently. And also in going through this process, we are not working towards a defined goal or outcome. It's original, it's different, and we have to dare to be different, and hence have a tolerance of uncertainty. And I think as teachers in a STEM inquiry program that's focused and child-centred, aiming to develop these creativity processes, it can be challenging for us too. So we also have to be able to tolerate the uncertainty that comes from creative practices in children's inquiry projects. So we can really give them the space and the time so they can put ideas into action, really daring to persist and to put things in practice. So the final element there, the experimenting. So I know the science teachers in the room will find a connection here, certainly. It is about investigating. It's about trying out new ideas, investigating different possibilities, and really tinkering and adapting ideas. we see children, and the young children are very good at doing this, at using materials in different ways. So they see it and imagine the possibility in the different ways a material could be used. For example, a handle of a broom can become so many things in a STEM inquiry project. It could be a slide, it could be an inclined plane, and so on and so on. So imagining how everyday resources can be used in different ways. So ultimately, children are working to create original and creative products, which could be an original thought or idea, or could be solving a problem in an original way that is fit to the purpose of the task. So that is a brief summary of the ADE framework, which, as I said, we found very powerful in continuing our analysis of data, but also our educators and teachers working with us have found this a valuable tool for their own professional learning, and they have been using it to guide their designing of STEM inquiry projects and their establishing of their learning environments, and in turn to help with assessment monitoring. How are the children developing this very critical and important 21st century learning skill of creativity? So I hope you also find the framework useful, both in your research and your practice as the classroom teacher. What I did want to do was share with you a STEM learning project where we applied this framework, and I want to give you some examples of how that looked and played out. So this was a coding project which we conducted in partnership with educators in an early years learning centre. So the children you're going to see in these photos, and I'm going to share their story with their learning, were 4 years of age. So the children were introduced to a Bebot, which is a coding device specifically designed for introducing young children to coding practices. So a Bebot is a mechanical interface push button where the children are putting in sequences of instructions and patterns of instructions that create a movement in the robot. So the children were breaking down the steps needed to move the coding toy, the bee, down the map, which was a road that came standard with the product. So children were engaging with lots of mathematical processes here in their STEM learning about orientation, left and right, how many steps, how far, and so on. And they were then, the teacher was scaffolding this to make it more concrete and enduring, using symbols to represent the actions and the directions that the children were coding into the robot. It was all very interesting. The children were enjoying playing with the coding device and learning about coding. But it really got, for us as researchers, it really got exciting when the children decided that they wanted to go off the road map. And because one of the children instigated this inquiry project by simply saying, this doesn't really make sense because bees don't live on the road. And so this generated a whole conversation, and then the movement onto a learning journey and inquiry project for children about environments and the living needs of a bee, and noticing bees in the garden, and then ultimately exploring the structure and production of a beehive for their coding toy. So the children, working with their teacher, decided that they wanted to make a new play world for their robot, the Bebot, and they wanted to draw on the inspiration of a storybook that they had been reading called Will Be the Bee. And so they worked together. They were looking to explore different concepts within their STEM inquiry. There was a lot of mathematics coming through out of the activity at this stage. So to make a playmat for Wilby that they named, they gave him a name, so for Wilby, to give him a play environment, they wanted to work out how far the robot would move in one coded action, so one movement forward or one movement left or right. So to do this, the teacher gave them a template, which was a non-standard unit of measurement, so they could just flip it over unit after unit and make this play mat. But one of the children, it was a bright group of children. They were in an early years centre on a university site, and both of the particular child, both his parents were studying a PhD. So this child sort of took the moments and, clearly there was thinking going on. He didn't articulate. He literally just got up and ran off, which we were a little bit surprised because he'd been so engaged with the activity. However, he quickly returned, much to everybody's delight, and came back with a ruler. So his understanding of measurement and the concept of a standard unit of measurement was beyond what had been expected by a 4-year-old, and hence he created and brought an element to the learning journey that was beyond what the teacher had initially planned. So there's a lot of value to listening to the voice and the actions of the children so that the learning can adjust to meet the needs of the child and to continue to develop from where the child is at. So that was an interesting learning and observation for us in this project. So lots of mathematics in this part of the project. You can see strong collaboration, trying out ideas, challenging ideas as well, connecting, and ultimately all these processes around working to create a product. Once they made their map and they included a lot of the elements from the storybook into their play mat for the bee, they also reflected that there was no home for Wilby in this play environment, and he needed to have a beehive. So this created another cycle of action for the children in their inquiry learning journey. They were drawing from design principles from the engineering space within the STEM notion of STEM, and they looked at different pictures and provocations around what beehives look like. They then did drawings and plans for their building and constructing, and ultimately they used a range of techniques, materials, using materials in different ways. I think from memory there was a balloon that sat inside that hive that they then painted and used in the play experience for Wilby. So again, lots of creativity and thinking if we go back and reflect on the creativity framework. Lots of different process skills were observed amongst the children here. It was very exciting to see and watch the children play with their new play mat and environment for Wilby the bee, and that they were then storytelling and they were sharing their stories with each other, not just verbally, but also by writing a symbolic code to represent the story that they had generated for the bee. This was extremely interesting for us because what it highlighted again is that don't underestimate what a 4-year-old can do. And these children were pre-formal literacy, which is probably, and you can see their fine motor skills in the recordings there, but they're pre-formal literacy. However, using symbolic representation in sharing the code, which in turn was creating pathways for storytelling, these children were actually retelling and following each other's coded stories through symbolic representation. So they were storytelling, they were telling stories in code, and they could read each other's code and set the device off according to these pathways in the storyboarding. So I did want to take this opportunity to share a very generous product from the Australian Government, the Department of Education, in partnership with the Science Discovery Centre in Perth SciTech and our Science Teachers Associations. This is called the STEM Learning Project. And I'm delighted to be able to share this with you because it is being made freely available, and I will give you the URL at the end of the presentation for you to go and explore the website and to draw from these programs and units. I'm going to show an example of a module with you and just go through really and again reflect back on, well, where is the creativity in children's STEM inquiry, and how can we as teachers scaffold the learning process and create an environment where children are doing the creative thinking. So I should have actually mentioned this particular module that I'm going to talk about here is called I Like Quiet. and I like noise. So it is based on sound outcomes for the young children involved. So this particular module was originally written for 4 to 5 year olds. So the STEM project took a problem-based approach to how it designed the STEM inquiry learning. So it was research. Children were encouraged to research a problem and to understand the context in which the problem was occurring. So they would investigate different parts of the context that impacted on the problem. Then they would be creative in their thinking and design and develop solutions to these problems. And importantly, and the last component in this model for these STEM programs was that they would evaluate their own products for fit for originality and fit for purpose and so on to see if it solved the original problem, and then they would share that with some sort of authentic type audience. So it's very much about child-focused STEM inquiry, and it's a child's learning journey. So the pedagogical principles and practices that were embedded in these modules were conducive to children's creative doing and thinking. So they were, and they are, intended to be collaborative in nature. So children working together, small group, collaborative activities. The children, through teachers' pedagogy, their intentionality in the conversations and the use of inquiry questioning, it's intended that children are provoked to think in higher order thinking, so that they are, really evaluating ideas and they're synthesizing and bringing ideas together, ultimately, when we think about Bloom's taxonomy, so that they are proposing these creative solutions to problems. So these modules are designed to scaffold and provoke and support children in higher order thinking, synthesizing, evaluating, and ultimately being creative and creative thinkers. So as I said, there's a focus in all of these modules and resources on questioning and conversations with children that elicits their thinking, children's ideas, children's own questions, and giving them the space and recognising the importance of their thinking. So children are prompted to explain what they've been learning and exploring and investigating. They're encouraged to use multiple modes for representing what they've done in STEM inquiry. So that could be with young children through talking, through drawing, perhaps even drama and dancing, song and dance, or going into the realm of the digital element with digital photos, or even perhaps like we saw with the Bebot and Wilby's playmat, where they're sharing through coding stories as well. So a whole range of different modes for communicating their science inquiry that are conducive to supporting creativity development as well. So this is an example from, I like it loud, I like it quiet. So all of the modules follow the same format. So it's starting with the research, where children are really presented with a problem that's meaningful to them, it's relevant in their context. So as educators, we should think about, what would be of interest and what is, and how perhaps you might even want to adapt some of these modules to ensure that the context is relevant to the children that you're going to connect with the ideas in the STEM inquiry. So identifying a problem, and then having the children research and find out as much about the context and the problem as they possibly can. So this particular module says, in a school situation, there's some places where children just need to be quiet, and there are other places where it's appropriate and in fact encouraged for children to be loud. But how do we understand the different volumes and levels of sound across a school? And then perhaps even for the younger children, remembering that these are 4 and 5 year olds, when is it appropriate to be quiet, like having an inside voice where we're respecting that people are thinking quietly or working quietly, or are we singing and dancing and making musical instruments and hence lots of noise? So just the problem being, some like it quiet, some like it loud. Sometimes loud noises are appropriate, sometimes they're not. So understanding the context and also the science concept of sounds and volume of sounds. So if you think from this through the creativity framework lens, what would be a creative product that the children may design, think about, design and create using all their processes in this element of the activity? Well, they might make a musical instrument, which has great science principles behind it, even in constructing different types of instruments, string instruments, columns of air, pipe instruments and so on. So all the children may simply use their body actions to make sounds, stamping their feet, clapping their hands, or playing digital, music and so on. But the important thing here is that the task is open. Allow children to explore and making sounds in different ways, and that there's not one prescribed outcome required for the children. So if we want them to be creative thinkers, and we want them to go through a process where they develop habits of creativity within STEM inquiry, we do need to give it time, we do need to resource it, and we do need to be open and have uncertainty in what the children might actually produce. So it takes a little bit of courage for the children, but also I think for us as educators too. So the next stage here is to then investigate what are the levels of sound like in the different areas of school. And there are some great apps that can be downloaded from the web that will actually digitally measure sound in the different areas. Or you may really introduce a mathematical concept of scale, 1 to 10. I think this one here actually goes from 0 to 5, and children can then, with a more of a qualitative measure of, is it quiet, is it a bit louder? Anyway, a sliding scale of 1 to 10, and there's a nice little example there. So what characteristics of children's creativity might you observe? Well, you might see them challenging other people's ideas. You may see them synthesizing ideas. You may see them tinkering or using materials for different purposes than what they were originally intended. But the focus here, again, is on not just the product, but the process that children go through as they are working in their STEM inquiry and constructing these types of creative products. Activity 3 in these modules, and as I said, they all follow the same design approach. So this is where the children are encouraged to imagine and create a representation of what they've found. So in this particular module, it's the drawing of a map, a bird's eye view, all the quiet places and noisy places that they've observed, and they may even use predictions as part of that process as they go and make their observations and record that on their map. So think about the digital elements within the children's experiences. Are they taking digital recordings? Can they maybe use an MP3 recorder and get sound recordings and so on? So again, resource it, allow different opportunities and outcomes and products for the children. So the learning environment is important, the resourcing, but also encouraging children to think creatively about the task and ensuring that, their ideas are heard, and that there is opportunity to, if something doesn't work, well, what do we learn from that? And so this notion of resilience and learning from errors and evolving our practices, trying out, tinkering and trying different things. So as I mentioned at the beginning, these STEM projects and modules are designed to and aim to elicit higher order thinking from the children. So we are wanting to see that children are not just memorising or demonstrating knowledge, low-level knowledge, they can remember facts. We're actually wanting them to see them thinking in a more sophisticated way, where they're synthesising ideas, they're evaluating different ideas, and ultimately the highest level, according to Bloom's taxonomy, we are seeing them thinking creatively and producing creative products. So again, I encourage you to think about not just our creative practice as teachers or even as researchers, but that we are empowering children for them to be creative in their processes too. And then the children that then self-reflect and determine whether their product was in fact fit for the purpose. Did it solve the problem they were exploring? And was it original? So as I said, these resources, there's a range of resources from for children from sort of 4 or 5 years up to 12 years of age, so the early years and the primary years of Australian schooling. And you can find all these free resources and modules on the education site. This is our West Australian education site. So I encourage you to explore it, have a look, and think about how you could adapt these modules to suit the context in Thailand or in the different areas of international contexts that you yourself may be working. So a couple of key learnings that have come out of all of this work that we've done to date, and the importance of how we provoke and support children's creative thinking in STEM inquiry, is keeping the tasks open. Let the children take the lead and provide resourcing and communication strategies where children are doing the thinking creatively for themselves, not just following the practices of a creative teacher. That we are integrating the domains within STEM, and that we really are pushing beyond just creativity as a product, that we are valuing the process and the process skills that children use and develop as they are innovating and learning and thinking creatively. I have one last thing that I did want to share with you before I finish here today. We have, and I'm very proud of this, worked with over 20 international educators and researchers and teachers who all contributed chapters to our latest book, Children's Creative Inquiry in STEM. So these teachers and researchers were sharing innovative practices where children were learning and developing creative thinking skills and capabilities and STEM capabilities in inquiry projects. Now, just as a gesture of goodwill and further connection, given that we are in a virtual space, if you email me, the very first person that emails me, I have a free e-copy of the book available. So I will happily email that back to the first person who I find in my inbox when I get back on my computer. So yes, please reach out, and I thank you for joining me in the presentation. And if you have any questions or anything you would like to connect with me about, there is my email address. And as I said, I promise I will send the first email in my inbox an e-copy of our book, which we're all very proud of having produced at this time. So thank you again. Thank you for having me at your conference, and I hope you enjoy the virtual networking and learn much from this experience and apply it back in your work context. Thank you.